Good morning. Could I welcome you all to today's meeting of the Public-Petitions-Committee? And as always, can I ask everyone to switch off mobile phones or electronic devices because it interferes with our sound systems. I also have apologies today from Jackson Carlo. Agenda item 1 is consideration of new petitions. The first item of business is consideration of new petitions. There are 6 new petitions for consideration today. The committee will hear evidence from petitioners on 3 of these. The first new petition is PE 1453 by Caroline Wilson on behalf of the Evening Times and Kidney Research UK Scotland on an opt-out system for organ donation in Scotland. Members have a note by the clerk, the spice briefing and the petition. Could I welcome both of our witnesses, Tony Carlin and Caroline Wilson. You're very welcome. Thanks very much for coming along today, and congratulations on your petition. And can I ask Tony Carlin if you'll make a short presentation of around 5 minutes. I'll ask a couple of questions to kick off, and I'll also ask my colleague Jackie Bailey, who's here on behalf of the petition as well, to say a few words. Then I'll ask my colleagues to ask you some questions. Mr. Carlin.
First of all, can I thank you for taking the time to listen to our reasons for calling for a change in the legislation on organ donation, as laid out in our Opt for Life campaign. Every day in the UK, 3 people die, usually needlessly, because of a shortage of suitable organs for transplantation. In Scotland, there are around 650 people waiting for a transplant to give them a second chance of life. Around 20% of those waiting for a new liver will die, not because they have to, but because a liver wasn't found in time. The figure for hearts is even higher. Those suffering from kidney failure too can die despite sometimes living quite miserable existences on dialysis, sometimes for years on end, surviving but with little quality of life. One of the things that shocked me and our team was that aside from the human need for kidneys for transplantation, it's a cost-effective treatment. The cost of keeping someone alive in dialysis for just 1 year is roughly equal to that of a transplant operation. And with some people who've been on dialysis in excess of 10, 15 and 20 years. The Scottish Government is to be commended for its incredible work over the past 5 years in increasing the number of people who have signed up to the Organ Donor Register, something which, although not our key goal, we've supported throughout the campaign by providing information on how to sign up to the register. However, the fact remains that despite an overwhelming number of members of the public, some figures suggest as many as 90%, backing the principles of donation, fewer than half of the Scottish population have signed up to the register, and there are places such as the west of Scotland where the numbers signed up are pitifully low. While it may be possible to change that under existing legislation, it is unlikely that this could happen in less than a decade or 15 years. Opt-out or presumed consent offers the possibility of delivering hope to those who will die in those years as they waited in vain for the phone to ring. That's why we're calling for a move to soft opt-out, where the presumption is that the deceased person wishes to donate their organs while still allowing the views of relatives to be taken into account and honoured. And there are plenty of safeguards in place to protect the young and the vulnerable. Families will still be consulted, but the conversation will start on the basis that the deceased had made a choice to donate. One of the myths about opt-out is that it somehow removes or limits the choices of the deceased. In fact, the reality is that the choices remain exactly the same, to donate or not to donate. Only the presumption changes. A universal, easy and accessible opt-out process is absolutely deliverable. Both the BMA and the Scottish Patients Association believe opt-out provides greater respect of the human rights and wishes of the patient. While it is almost impossible to find exact measures of the success of opt-out in other countries like Belgium and Spain, because it is usually part of a wider donation strategy, the research we found suggests that it makes a statistically significant positive improvement. Luke Collenby, head of Belgium's transplant strategy, noted an 86% increase in the number of kidneys retrieved for transplant when that country switched to opt-out. And today only a tiny amount, 1.7% of a population of 11 million, have said they wish to opt-out. In Spain, there are 35 donors per million, while in the UK the figure is around 15. And in 2015, Wales will become the latest country to switch to opt-out, which it views as an effective means of increasing the number of life-saving transplants. All of that is why we began our Opt for Life campaign, which has now received the support of, among others, the British Medical Association, the Scottish Patients Association, the British Heart Foundation, Kidney Research UK, the Royal College of Surgeons, the Cystic Fibrosis Trust, the Scottish Kidney Federation and the National Kidney Federation. Soft opt-out has also been adopted as policy by both Labour and the Lib Dems. has the support of the majority of MSPs across all parties, and it deserves strongly held belief among the general public. When we started the campaign, we set a target of 10,000 for our petition. Even after we reached that target, and without us pushing much harder, the signatures kept coming in. We've now got around 18,000 names on the petition, and remember, this is essentially a Glasgow and West of Scotland initiative. I've no doubt that a national campaign would have received even greater support. Now, I could speak for hours about some of the stories we've told or come across in the course of our campaign. The anguish of parents watching their children die needlessly of a genetic condition which could be resolved with a transplant. The desperation of a man who flew to India in the hope of buying a kidney. The deep satisfaction felt by grieving relatives who consoled themselves with the knowledge that others were given the gift of life following the death of a loved one. However, there's little point, because each of you knows or has read of someone in the same position, waiting for the phone call that may never come, while living a life of increasing misery, fear and despair. A switch to soft opt-out legislation will certainly not decrease the number of donors, and could at a stroke provide many more gifts of life. And that's why I hope you will give due consideration to our petition. Every year we wait, desperate people die. It's our belief in that of organisations like the BMA, the Royal College of Surgeons and a raft of health charities and patient groups that a change in legislation can save dozens, perhaps hundreds of lives over the next decade. However, if it only saves a handful of people, a son, a daughter, a mother, a father, it will have been a change for the better. Please take this opportunity to give hope to those people waiting today for the call that won't just change their life, but which will save it. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Before I ask you some questions, can I bring my colleague Jackie Bailey?
Convener, and thank you to the members of the committee for allowing me to say a few words this morning. Can I start by commending the Evening Times on their Opt-Out for Life campaign? I think it has been a measure of how remarkable journalism can be in terms of promoting positive good. And in these times, I think it's a shining example of what can be achieved. We know people, hundreds of people, are currently waiting for an organ donation. And we know that indeed, as Tony himself said, 90% of people support organ donation. Yet, despite the government's very commendable efforts, only something like half of that number are registered as organ donors. So there's a huge opportunity there that we could capitalise on. An overwhelming majority of that number, I believe something in excess of 70%, of people in Scotland support a shift to a soft opt-out system of organ donation. And, you know, as has been described, this operates very much on the basis of presumed consent, but families must still be consulted. So there are safeguards within that proposed system. And for me, the clincher was that opt-out systems in other countries show a 30% increase on donation rates. And that, frankly, means saving lives. Soft opt-out is Labour Party policy, but this isn't something that I regard as a party political issue. I know Alex Neil, before he became the Cabinet Secretary for Health and Wellbeing, also supported a soft opt-out system, so I am very hopeful on that basis that we can make progress. And indeed, my colleague Drew Smith, who sends his apologies because he can't be here this morning because he's in another committee meeting, has announced his intention to take forward a members' bill based on the bill introduced by our colleagues in the Welsh Assembly, if the government aren't prepared to legislate. So this committee could do a power of good in trying to encourage the government to legislate in an area where I would suggest they would command cross-party support in the chamber. And finally, Convener, you know, it is a change. It is perhaps just a small change, but the significance of it is that it would indeed save lives, and that's something that we should take forward in this Parliament. Thank you.
Could I thank Jackie Bailey for her comments, and very appreciate Jackie Bailey coming along. So my first question really is just to echo my point at the start, Mr Calling and Caroline Wilson, is that I think this is a good example of how to put a petition together. I think you've got over 10,000 signatures, and it's clearly something that every right-thinking person would want to support. We know that we need to have more organ donation in the UK as a whole, and certainly within Scotland. Clearly, some would say that there's obviously ethical, medical and legal issues surrounding this. Not necessarily my particular arguments, but nevertheless, could I just put on the record that there is some issues around the ethics of this? Do you feel your petition covers some of the ethical issues surrounding organ donation?
I fully understand concerns over the hard opt-out situation where you do have parents and loved ones perhaps sometimes unnecessarily hit with distress that they really are not capable of handling. Soft opt-out essentially changes one part. It changes the question. It changes the point of the conversation where the nursing team first interface with the relatives. We're starting from a position where we care about what the relatives feel, but similarly we care about what the patient who's sadly deceased has felt in their lifetime. Bottom line is nothing changes. The right to donate or not to donate is still within the gift of the donor. I think soft opt-out addresses most of the concerns that people would have when it comes to the relatives. Similarly, the separation between the transplant team and the treatment team at medical level means that there should be no ethical issues, because we're talking about two different parts of the medical team who are very independent and operate independently, and I think that a lot of the ethical concerns really don't exist, and don't exist under the current system either.
Can I just say, obviously it would have to be made very easy to opt out. That's one of the key things. And research actually shows that medics find it easier to approach families if the presumption is that it's the norm to donate. So in countries that have presumed consent, doctors find it easier to approach relatives. And one of the other concerns that comes up sometimes is, will they switch my life support machine? I mean, that does come up in the public. People are afraid of that. Will they switch my life support machine off quicker? But at the end of the day, doctors have a duty of care to do everything that they can to save the life of a patient, and that's not going to change under an opt-out system.
So do you think it's important then to try and shift the culture of donation in Scotland?
Exactly. But the thing, if we were to move to opt-out, they would have to have, obviously, a massive publicity campaign, and that gets people talking about organ donation. You're more likely to tell your relatives what your wishes are, which is a key factor as well.
My final question before bringing my colleagues in. Have either of you looked at the UK Organ Donation Task Force, which I understand made 14 different recommendations? They argue that if the recommendations are taken up, they would increase donation rates by 50% over 5 years. Does your petition effectively chime with the UK Organ Donation Task Force?
I think that Caroline is probably a wee bit more au fait with the detail than I am, but certainly the Organ Donation Task Force accepted in 2008 that no matter what happened, things had to change. There were not enough organs available, and it was vital that something changed. Now, some of that has been addressed, particularly in areas like Lothian in Scotland, where we've had an exceptional turnaround in the number of people signing up for the register. Bottom line is we still have far too few people. So they have previously accepted a need for change, and they're obviously going to report back next year on how they figure out the progress has been made, what progress has been made, and where we take things forward. What they did also find, though, is that 72% of people back in 2008, 72% of people favoured a switch to opt-out. I would suggest that figure is significantly higher nowadays, and it will continue to grow, because I think there is a real momentum behind a switch to this, because I think people, frankly, are fed up with people dying needlessly. Caroline, I don't know if you've got anything.
Well, I mean, in 2008, obviously at the start of the 5-year review, Nicola Sturgeon set a target for an increase of 50%. And at the time, she knew that would be met, but she, was quoted on the record saying, "But more will still have to be done. I know we'll achieve this, but more has to be done," because we're still sitting at, 40% on the register.
So the rates, frankly, are far too low then.
Well, they are.
It's causing a huge problem in Scotland.
They are, and most charities, experts believe that opt-out is the best way to significantly increase the pool of donors.
Thank you.
I think from our point of view, people will die because of organ failure. That's inevitable. That get 100% people signing up is not going to solve that. But frankly, nobody should be dying because there's a shortage. That just is not any longer acceptable within our society. We have the capability to save so many of these people's lives, and it's just not acceptable that we're not doing so.
Thank you for that, and I bring some of my colleagues. Anne McTaggart.
Welcome, panel. Get the mic on? Yeah, that's us. I've got a few questions to ask, and one of them has briefly been spoke about earlier, is about the Welsh Assembly. Can you tell me what lessons have you learned from what happens there and how that's influenced you?
Well, I mean, there's a variety of things that they're going to be doing. Obviously, it's not for me to work out the logistics, but they're going to have 2 registers in Wales where you can opt in or opt out. I mean, whether that complicates things, I'm not sure, but it does mean that you can, register whether you're in or out rather than not. They're also, they're spending a lot of money on a publicity campaign to educate people. I think they've just been really open and transparent. There seems like there's quite a good public awareness about the need for this. So I think they've done very well in educating people about the change.
Can you take me on swiftly to my next question? Later on today, we do have another petition presented before us, and it's really talking about the links between the organ transplantation and cancer by providing appropriate guidance and education to medical professionals. Can you tell me any of the information that I've read through Evening Times or about the campaign? I've never really read any of that information. It's never came across in any of the information that you have given out.
Before, sorry.
No.
The links between organ transplantation and cancer.
To be honest, I'm not qualified to give a medical answer.
No, I don't really understand. Can you clarify what you mean by that?
There is a petition being placed before us today, and there is links. They're wanting to raise the awareness of the links between organ transplantation.
I see. Okay. To be honest, it's not been part of our campaign. Without professing to be a medical expert, I would suggest that whatever information is out there, we'd be happy to publicise as much as we possibly can. But I'd also suggest that if we're talking about a link to perhaps say somebody who's got 6 months to live with a kidney transplant, and you say to them there's a risk of perhaps contracting cancer, a higher risk of contracting cancer, I suggest they'd still take the kidney every time.
Actually, this was brought to my attention yesterday, Cystic Fibrosis Trust. I know there's a case in England where someone with cystic fibrosis was given a lung transplant and later contracted lung cancer. The Cystic Fibrosis Trust would say, if you bring in an opt-out system, you've got more organs, you've got more to choose from. That addresses that problem.
But
while they would still accept, they do accept lung transplants from smokers. If there's a bigger pool, they've got a better choice, and this kind of thing wouldn't happen. Obviously,
if there was more research, the information, obviously you've agreed that information would be disseminated to that.
Well, absolutely. I don't think any surgical procedure will ever come without risk, and this is one that clearly will have risk. But I think it's a matter of making sure that patients are aware of the risks and making sure that patients are aware that there are consequences to take the organ and consequences of not taking the organ. And I think as long as they're made fully aware of all those issues, it's absolutely right that it's not Tony Carlin's decision, and it's not Amit Taggart's decision, and it's not even the doctor's decision. It's the patient's decision. It's important that the information is given to them as clearly as possible, and if that means more research is required, well, more research is required. But I don't think that compromises what we're talking about here today.
Okay, thank you. Chick Brody.
Good morning. Listen, Mr. Carlin. I think this is a laudable campaign. But why the Evening Times? What prompted you to start this campaign? What was the basis?
I have to say, I've been editor of the Evening Times for 4 years, and in that time, I've worked at the Evening Times for 22 years, and frankly, when I became editor, one of the first things that came across my table was, yet again, if you live in Glasgow in the west of Scotland, you die far too young. If you live in a place called Carlton, your life expectancy as a male is under 60. And it's something that has appalled me for years. So we have run, in the time that I've been editor, we've run Glasgow's health campaign. In fact, Jackie Bailey was kind enough to come and help us with one of the events we ran as part of that, where we got Glasgow to stop out 1 million cigarettes, walk 1 million miles, and lose £500,000. We've run a Clear the Air anti-smoking campaign, which has been the most successful anti-smoking campaign that NHS Greater Glasgow has ever been involved in, and saw the smoking cessation.
So was this your personal motivation?
This one's totally mine. I'm passionate about health. I'm passionate about the life expectancy of people in Glasgow, and yes, this is very much my baby. But it's something that this doesn't sell papers. Health campaigns do not sell newspapers. This is about the social responsibility. It comes sometimes of being editor of a paper like the Evening Times, and yes, I take it very personally. So that's where the starting point is.
Okay, good. I wonder, on that basis, and you mentioned Belgium and Spain, and while I'm sure that some of the issues, ethical, legal, etc., can be overcome, what difficulties have arisen in the countries that you mentioned in terms of soft opt-out?
Caroline, you maybe know better than me.
I mean, I'm not aware of any obvious difficulties, really. I know in Belgium it's worked very well, but the point is that it has to be part of a package of measures. It's not going to work on its own, and that's been proven in Spain. You've got to increase your transplant coordinators, intensive care beds. It won't work on its own.
No, I understand that, but there has to be a downside somewhere. I mean, what particular difficulties?
There's always going to be people that won't agree to this, but the safeguard is there for them to opt out. As long as it's made easy for people to opt out, I don't see what the problem is. Sorry.
I was going to say, given that in Belgium only 1.7% have opted out, I think it shows that while there may be very individual and very specific issues arise from time to time, the vast bulk of the population are quite comfortable with it. And this is an opt-out that's been in since 1986. So it's a long proven track record that they've got there, and they don't have issues.
Yeah. At the end of the day, there's 28 countries in Europe that are doing this successfully.
I would also suggest that any problems that may arise, we can learn the lessons from all these other countries that have already brought it in. So hopefully, I wouldn't anticipate us making the same mistakes as, say, Belgium made back in 1986, because I would imagine they've had 30 years to fix things, and we will learn from those lessons.
No, I understand that, but clearly one could argue that there is already a soft opt-out in some cases. But if you look at children, for example, that must throw up some difficulties, emotional difficulties.
I think you have to have all sorts of safeguards in place, but I think when the conversation at all times starts with a presumption, I think parents become much more aware of the need to have conversations. I think parents become aware of the norm is that donation is what happens. And I think it's changing that basic perception as a starting point. But in terms of making sure that children and vulnerable people are protected, there have got to be all sorts of safeguards in there. I think in Wales, for instance, they're going for an age limit of 18. I would suggest 16 is actually much more realistic, because if you can get married at 16 and if you can vote in a referendum at 16, I would suggest that you can decide whether you want to donate your organs or not. But that's something that is...
Accept that.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, John Wilson.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. Questions just to examine some of the figures you gave Caroline earlier. You said that in 2008, 72% of the population supported the issue of opt-out. Now, that was 2008. You gave an indication that there might be more people actually support it now. Do you have any further information or up-to-date information on how many people would support an opt-out position?
I think there's been estimates that it's as high as 90% now, but I could obviously provide more information to back that up.
That would be useful, just so we can actually look at it, because you, quite clearly in your supporting statement, along with the petition, you indicate that the Scottish Government is not doing everything it can to radically improve donor rates. Yet the Cabinet Secretary for Health in 2008 said at that time the Scottish Government were committed to try and raise awareness and get the issue of donors and people donating organs on death and trying to get that issue highlighted and raise the targets. You gave a figure now, I think it's the UK figure, it was about 50%, to increase it to 50%. But you said we were now up to around about 40%?
Yeah, I think we're just at 40% in
just
Scotland,
at 40%.
which is higher than other parts of the UK.
How much higher than other parts of the UK?
I think I think England's sitting at 30%, Scotland's 40%.
I think, to be honest, we do think that within the existing legislation that the government has actually done an exceptional job. In places like Lothian in particular, they have excelled. So we're certainly not in any dispute as to how successful the government has been under the existing legislation. We just believe that opt-out would make it better.
On the basis of that, do you think it's the health boards that are promoting a better campaign? You indicated that Lothian seems to have a higher rate than, say, Greater Glasgow and Clyde. Would you put that down to whether it's the Scottish Government's campaign or the local health board campaigns? And if it's local health board campaigns, are health boards doing enough to promote the issue?
I met Michael Matheson last week. He was very generous with his time, and I think the bottom line is nobody knows exactly why Lothian has been more successful than other parts. I mean, part of it might well be because of Edinburgh Royal Infirmary being one of the key centres, that perhaps there's a higher awareness of the need for organ donation. But it's been a long, hard slog. But there have been successful areas. But I don't think anybody can say that it's down to an awareness of how the health board have been doing the campaign, or the Scottish Government have been doing the campaign, or the fact of geography with the Edinburgh Royal being where it is. They're going to clearly, obviously, try and learn the lessons, but rolling those lessons out do take, well, I think you all know, it's going to take a long time, whereas we think opt-out delivers quickly.
But, I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, 90% of people support organ donation, 40% in the register. People are dying because of apathy, basically.
Well,
for whatever reason, people are not signing the register.
That's true, that people aren't signing the register. What I'm trying to get to is where we can move the situation forward without necessarily having to introduce new legislation. And if it is through greater awareness and greater campaigning that can be taken up by health boards and the Scottish Government, then surely that would be a better way than trying to legislate in relation to organ donation.
Well, I'd suggest over the last 2 years, because clearly I'm going to take some credit for it, but within the west of Scotland, probably the issue of organ donation's never had a higher profile than it has just now. But the bottom line is the results in the west of Scotland are still disappointing. The local health board, Glasgow NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde, have done some exceptional work themselves, and they are having a wonderful campaign to try and encourage people to discuss the importance of getting their needs, or making their needs known to their relatives. So I'd suggest that the profile of organ donation has never been higher in the west of Scotland than it is just now, and has been for the last 2 years. But frankly, the numbers are still very disappointing. So I don't think there is any one issue that you can point to and say that's the answer.
And the question is, how long do you wait before the numbers? I mean, we're not saying that this couldn't be achieved, that numbers couldn't rise through other methods, but how long is that going to take? It could be decades.
As I said, what I'm trying to do in the committee this morning is just examine the issues that you've raised in the petition and how we actually take this petition forward. And I'm very supportive of the objectives behind the petition, and I do have a donor card myself that I carry. So the issue is quite clear to me that we need more donors, but it's trying to examine, in terms of some of the responses we may get back as a committee, we've got to, this is our opportunity to examine yourselves in relation to getting some responses. You also indicated in the supportive information that where individuals have declared in terms of presumed consent to give organ donation, the relatives would be less likely to refuse consent. What evidence do you have to actually support that statement?
Well, basically, family refusal rates in countries that have presumed consent. I mean, I've got here Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland and Slovak Republic. They've all got systems of presumed consent, and the family refusal rate is less than 10%. In the UK, it's 40%. I mean, it's all to do with the culture of organ donation in those countries. It becomes the norm to donate. Therefore, it's easier to approach the families, and you know, the families will.
But that 40% rate in the UK is without presumed consent. Is that just the approaches that are being made by medical staff?
Exactly. And at the end of the day, families are refusing consent for relatives who may have wished to donate. So.
Thank you very much.
Jackie Bailey, followed by Angus MacDonald.
It's in response to John Wilson, just one small minor point. It might be instructive for the committee to have a look at what the Welsh Assembly has proposed, but they also published research to indicate a very close association between those operating a legislatively based soft opt-out system in terms of the increased rate of donations. But can I just say, legislation avoids the need to keep up the level of publicity over successive generations, because it's not just, you know, a once-in-a-generation push. It would need to be repeated, and I think a more cost-effective and actually, you know, in terms of organ donation, a more effective way of proceeding would indeed be to legislate in the manner described by the Evening Times.
John Wilson?
Convener, can I just clarify from Ms Bailey what she's actually saying there? That did you say, and did I pick up correctly by saying that if we actually went for the soft option, we wouldn't have to continually remind people that they're actually presumed consent if they didn't opt out? Because
you would, as part of the campaign, of course, need to tell people about their rights in terms of opting out. But the effort that's going in currently to get to the level of 40%, which is impressive, you know, is unlikely to be improved dramatically, particularly if we don't understand which part of it is currently working to best effect. I believe that actually if you adopted a legislatively based system, then as part of, you know, ordinary everyday work, that would be done for those who wish to opt out. But actually the efforts going in just now would need to be repeated over successive generations in order to even maintain the level at 40%, never mind push it to where it needs to be, which is the 90% of, you know, people who currently support organ donation.
Convener, I accept what Ms Bailey is saying, but I also think it would be incumbent on any government and any health service to continually to remind individuals of the soft opt-out position, particularly families, that was because we dealt with a petition a couple of weeks ago, Convener, at this committee, where the body on death is the part of the estate, belongs to the family, and the family can then decide at the present moment how they dispose of that body, whether organs or the whole body. So therefore, there are other pieces of legislation that we need to look at to make sure that if we're going for a soft option or soft opt-out clause, that people are constantly aware, and that will be an intergenerational issue as well, that we need to make people aware that there is a presumed consent for everyone, unless they actually take that opt-out.
Thanks for that. I'll maybe try and still engage with our witnesses here. Angus MacDonald?
Yes, thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. Can I just perhaps explore the Welsh example a wee bit more, which has been raised this morning, and I believe it's still a proposal, it's not actually implemented yet. Do you know if the Welsh have a projected figure for their system to increase donation figures, and also if they have a projected figure for opt-outs?
They estimate that they'll have an extra 45 organs for transplant each year. If you equate that with Scotland, that could be between 60 and 70. So it's, you know, it's a fair enough figure. In terms of, are you asking me about cost to implement?
Percentages, actually. Do you have a percentage? Do they have a percentage projection of the opt-out figures?
I mean, I could get that information to you. I know.
Yeah, no, I just thought you might have it.
I don't have it right now.
Okay.
In terms of, I mean, we've got figures for other countries, obviously. Belgium, I think it's 2% opting out.
And Spain?
Sorry, 1.7 is what I've got.
Have you got
1.7.
okay.
Have the Spanish figure?
I don't have the Spanish figure right now.
The Spanish is 35 per million, as opposed to the UK of 15 per million. So that maybe gives you an indication of what we're talking about.
Adam Ingram.
Yeah, good morning, panel. I'm just curious, you've presented the case very well for a soft opt-out today, and you've highlighted the weight of evidence from other countries which suggests that organ donation rates has improved. And you're also suggesting that the policy of a soft opt-out would be very popular in the country. Why then do you think that the UK Organ Donation Task Force did not recommend moving to a soft opt-out system, and in the recommendations, the 14 recommendations, I understand, to improve the current situation, but they did say there were significant downsides to introducing a soft opt-out system. How do you explain that? This is a particular group of experts brought together to look at the problem of organ donation, and they didn't arrive at the same conclusion as you do.
I think if you put any two surgeons in the same room, you'll come up with three answers to every question that's put to them. I genuinely don't know. However, if you speak to Professor John Forsyth at Edinburgh Royal, he'll say he's marginally against going to to soft opt-out. If you speak to is it Mackey, Dr. Mackey at the Glasgow Health Heart Transplant Unit at the Jubilee, he says exactly the opposite. He backs it. So I would imagine there's plenty. I would imagine that within the task force there was no real unanimity. I know it's sometimes presented as that, as you're aware, sometimes committees will bring forward things, and that's the decision that they've come forward with. But I'd be astonished if it was actually unanimous. I'd similarly be astonished if opt-out is not given much more credence when they report next year. But the bottom line is, I think when you look at that stat from 2008 of 72%, even by their own estimation, 72% of people believed that opt-out was the way forward. I think I'm actually frankly astonished that they didn't go for it first time around, but I think I'll be even more astonished if they don't go for it this time. And I think the mood of the public is very much that of a group of people who want to change this law and want to save lives, because as I say, why they came to their conclusion, I don't know, but you could point to 28 other countries that disagreed with them.
Okay, but there's a host of other countries, obviously, who are retaining the opt-in system.
Well, I'm not aware of anybody who went to opt-out and then changed their mind and went back to opt-in. So, I suggest that the lesson that each one of them has learned is that this is something that works, and it's certainly not one we're going to change.
And one of the arguments that's used, particularly by health professionals, is that they fear that the element of trust that is essential between clinicians and patients might be under some strain if people feel that, particularly with end-of-life care, that people are being looked at for organ harvesting purposes, and this might change the culture or the emotional, if you like, the emotional atmosphere within the context of caring for people. How would you answer that?
I fully understand and agree with you that there are issues that need to be dealt with, but I think information, being open with the patients, having dialogue with the patients is absolutely essential. I mean, the bottom line is, the patient associations that we've spoken to don't have that as an issue. The patient associations believe that the wishes of the patients are actually going to be better taken care of by having soft opt-out as the way forward. I'd also suggest that by having the separation between the treatment teams and the transplantation teams, that we already have a safeguard in there where nobody can sensibly accuse MD of harvesting. I think you're absolutely right, though, to say that we need to explain that to the wider public so as they understand that there are safeguards in there, that harvesting, while it might be a fear, is actually something that really can't happen. It can't happen within the existing system, regardless of whether we go to opt-out or not.
Chick Brodie.
Thank you. Thanks, Convener. In all of this, and those who sympathise, there is a concern if we don't do it, or is there a concern that we end up with an international trade in organs? And given what's happening with the health service in privatisation down south, is there a danger that we find that countries like Belgium and Spain that do have the soft opt-out may become purveyors and providers of organs if we don't go down this road?
What would be a concern about that? I mean, for instance, if my child needed an organ transplant, it wouldn't bother me in the slightest if it was somebody who came from France.
I think the concern, Mr. Carlin, is that we then get into a market situation of buying and then hyping, costs, and therefore generally distorting the rationale behind people in other countries opting out.
I'm not aware that that's been an issue with any of the other countries. I believe that there are occasionally international transplants that already happen, with the current system, and I would imagine that would still continue to happen. I'm not aware of anybody suggesting, certainly within the European context, that that's an issue that they have come across. Go beyond Europe, I can't guarantee that that's the case. I mean, we've all heard stories, and we've reported stories ourselves about somebody being desperate enough to go and buy a kidney in India. So I can't say that there would be an absolute guarantee in any of this, but I would suggest that that's the case just now anyway. There is a possibility of that, but I'm not aware of it ever being raised as an issue within Europe.
Thank you.
So, thank you very much for that. I mean, can I say again, can I thank both of you for coming along today. The committee will now, if you just wait for a few seconds, the committee will now look at the next options. But I can say on a personal level, I hope other newspapers across Scotland take a leaf out of your book and look at campaigns like this. This is certainly one of the best petitions that I've certainly seen in the last year and a half or so that I've been doing this job. And just as you were talking, actually, I thought that arguably the best Christmas present anyone can give is to sign up for organ donation and let your nearest and dearest know. So it's perhaps something your readers, I'm sure, will look at to the next edition. As far as next steps, clearly I think the committee are very positive about your petition and would want to continue the petition to take advice from obviously the Scottish Government. Clearly NHS, Blood and Transplant, the British Transplantation Society and the BMA all would be very relevant bodies. Can I just ask whether, John Wilson, you have any other ideas that we can write to?
Convener, yes I do. Could I suggest we also write to Greater Glasgow and Clyde Health Board to ask them about Respect My Dying Wish campaign and what successes they've seen to date in that campaign, and could also suggest, given that we've got evidence today, or presented evidence today, that Lothian and Borders Health Board seem to have a successful rate, then we write to them to ask them what materials or discussions they are having in terms of increasing the number of patients or individuals opting in at the present moment, so we can get a feel for what's happening across the country and what campaigns have been successful or less successful.
Yeah,
thank you. Other members have any other suggestions?
No, I support it. I wouldn't just restrict it to if there's best practice, then we should request, instruct, ask the other health that be looked at by all the other health boards to see what might be done.
Is that agreeable? So can I thank, first of all, Jackie Bailey for coming along and supporting the petition, and for Tony and Caroline for giving up their time to present the evidence today. Thank you. It was very good evidence. I'll suspend for 2 minutes to allow our witnesses to leave. The second new petition today is PE 1448 by Grant Thompson on improving awareness of the cancer risks in organ transplantation. Members have a note by the clerk and the Spice briefing and the petition. Could I welcome both witnesses, Grant Thompson and Sean Argue. Thank you very much for coming along today. Can I invite Mr Thompson to give a short presentation of around 5 minutes, and I'll kick off with the first couple of questions, then my colleagues will come in. And Mr Argue, please feel free to intervene and ask any questions you wish during the evidence session. Mr Thompson.
Thank you. I hadn't actually prepared a written down statement as such. Wasn't entirely sure what to expect from today, and if I'm being perfectly honest, I'd much rather not be sitting here, given the circumstances surrounding why we are. But the brief I was given was not to go over ground that was already covered in the petition, but was to perhaps elaborate on certain issues. But just as a brief introduction or a brief resume, Sean Argue, to my left, was Sharon Argue's father. Sharon Argue was my partner of 12 years and mother to my 2 children, and Sharon died in July this year after a short battle with skin cancer. Sharon had received a kidney transplant in 2004. That's actually quite a coincidence what the first petition that you were discussing this morning was about. Sharon was never made aware of the risks that she was at of contracting or developing skin cancer. And when the question was put to the previous 2 incumbents of these chairs, and they've obviously done a lot of research into the issue of organ transplant, it struck me as being kind of news to them as well. The reason I started researching this was a comment made by the consultant who was treating Sharon about an hour before she died, was that it would seem that unfortunately the cause or the likelihood of her cancer was as a result of the medication she was taking subsequent to her kidney transplant, cyclosporin, which is an immunosuppressant medication which prevents the body rejecting the new organ. He referred to this as chemotherapy. Basically, it's an extremely toxic treatment, but it's essential. If patients aren't provided with this, the transplant will, in majority or in 99.9% of cases, will fail. So this, I just want to be clear that this petition, campaign, whatever you want to call it, is not a campaign against the use of cyclosporin. You know, and what the editor of the Evening Times had responded to that question was saying that I'm sure if somebody was given the option, well, you've got 6 months to live unless you have a transplant, but the downside of that is there is a high risk that you'll develop skin cancer at some point post-op, that they would without doubt take the transplant. And from personal experience, and I can't speak for Sharon because unfortunately she's not here to speak for herself, I know for a fact that if she'd been told the risk is 80% of patients will get skin cancer, I know for a fact she would still have taken the operation, the transplant, because a life in dialysis wasn't for her. And I've seen what that can do to people. People who require a heart or a liver transplant don't have that option. If they don't get a transplant, they will die. So, again, just to reiterate, it's not a campaign against the use of cyclosporin. It is, I suppose you would call it a miracle drug. I mean, it's given life to tens of thousands of people around the world since its immunosuppressant properties were discovered in the early 70s. However, there is an issue regarding understanding, and I feel understanding among the medical profession as well as patients, that just how toxic and potentially damaging that this medication can be. Research, I mean, I spent half an hour, a week after she died, I spent half an hour on Google. I don't have no medical background at all. A simple search, cyclosporin, organ transplant, skin cancer, and the information that I've presented in that petition came from that search. And I still find it hard to believe that there seemed to be such a lack of understanding about it within. In my, I can only give you my own anecdotal experience, but there's no reason for me to sit here and make things up. That doctors that I've spoken to subsequently have been shocked at just how high the risk skin cancer in transplant patients is. Conservative estimates put it at 35% of patients will develop skin cancer within 20 years post-op. Other estimates put it at 40%, rising to 70% in warmer climates. So it's an issue to do with UV radiation and the fact that what the changes that the medication makes to makes within the body when it's taken over a long period. When you have a transplant, you have to stay on this medication for the rest of your life. So it's not a case of the medication that can be reduced in dose, but it has to be maintained, indefinitely. So there's no option. There's no option to stop this. To my understanding and to my uneducated eye and the limited research I've done in the past 4 months, there are no alternatives to it. So it is a necessity, but the issue arises. The 3 issues that have been put in the petition are awareness of just how high the risks are amongst the medical profession, awareness amongst patients of how toxic the medication that they're taking actually is. Again, anecdotally, but again, I have no reason to make this up. I started this campaign on Facebook. I've had messages from people on Facebook who I don't know who have said that it's not just organ transplant patients that prescribe this. Patients can be prescribed it for severe eczema and psoriasis and also autoimmune diseases. People have contacted me to say that they're on it, or they know somebody that's on it, or their child is on it for another condition, and they had no idea that there is this risk with long-term use of this medication. So it's clear to me that there is a serious issue, that people are unaware of the drawbacks of this medication. And the third issue is that I feel that the warnings or the patient information provided by the pharmaceutical company is nowhere near sufficient. The patient information leaflet that is provided with cyclosporin is 25 pages. There is mention of skin cancer on the 25th page, but it's listed alongside side effects such as nausea, dizziness and headache, which now, if you're to read a list of side effects on even a common day-to-day medication such as aspirin, you probably wouldn't take it because you think, well, go look at all the things that could potentially happen. But the fact that this medication does, the evidence I've seen, albeit on the internet, is that this medication does cause cancer. It's an unavoidable drawback in some people. The substance itself is a group 1 carcinogen. The fact that there are no greater health warnings on the medication, the fact that health professionals are prescribing it and not being fully aware of just how potentially serious it can be, I feel that needs to change, which is I've probably run on a bit longer than 5 minutes, so I apologise, but that's the reason why we started this campaign.
No, Tom, and again, I know it must be very painful for both of you coming along today, and obviously on behalf of the committee, can I put our condolences for the loss that both of you experienced. I've got a couple of questions, and I'd like to bring my colleagues in. Your petition makes clear that some health boards have education and awareness programmes and annual skin screening clinics for patients, and others do not. Have you worked out which health boards provide this and which don't?
I know I've received a message from a nephrologist in NHS 5 who had contacted me to say that he'd read the details on Facebook and to say that he was very dismayed that this kind of late diagnosis was still happening. He had said that it's a large part of his job is educating people before and after transplant as to just how careful they have to be in terms of going out, wearing long sleeves, wearing wide-brimmed hats in the sun, covering their skin, checking themselves regularly for any abnormalities in their skin. He also said that for transplant patients, high-factor sun protection is available in free prescription, which again was something that we were just completely unaware of. So it's a bit of a cliche, but postcode lottery is really what it kind of how I would sum it up. And that this doctor, I don't want to name in person, but had asked for a copy of the petition and would circulate it and sign it, and committed to saying that the campaign had his backing. NHS Lanarkshire, where Sharon was treated, unfortunately, don't appear to be as switched on as NHS Fife for whatever reason. I don't know. I know that when I spoke to the consultant who had treated Sharon up to her death, who wasn't a renal consultant, was an infections consultant, that's where she was admitted, had said that in Monklands Hospital plans were afoot to introduce a skin clinic for transplant patients. Plans had been afoot for some time, but it just never happened. I presume it's like everything else, it's a question of time and money. Anecdotally again, I was told that dermatology had spoken to this doctor and they said this reinforces the need that we need to get this up and running as soon as.
I don't think postcode lottery is actually a cliche at all, and certainly our experience in the committee is this happens quite regularly in a whole variety of health issues, that one health board provides it and another doesn't, and then it makes it a lottery according to which treatment you're going to get. My second question is, should patients be then better informed about risk of skin cancer prior to transplants taking place?
Yeah, definitely should be.
Okay, Stargate?
Yeah. Sharon, I says, looked after herself quite well. As Grant said, she would have took the transplant regardless for a better quality of life. But she had a spot in the rear. If she knew the risk then, the spot could have been dealt with and process removed before in her bloodstream.
Yeah, she developed a small growth on her ear, which it looked like a spot, and that turned out to be the primary source of the cancer. Now, as Sean says, Sharon was very, very fastidious with her health, and she just, if she'd known the potential risk she was at, she would have had that checked out immediately. And in actual fact, she presented that to her own renal consultant 2 weeks before she died.
She jumped me by the head there. Before she went there, she went to one doctor who told her an infection. Gave her antibiotics. Went to the emergency doctors in the Monklands Hospital. As an infection, gave her the antibiotic. Before she went to run, I said to her, go on the kidney check, I think it was a problem coming from there for the pain she was getting. They done some blood tests, gave her increased iron tablets, etc. And asked her to come back the following week. And that's when they admitted her. They fully checked over. We're talking here, period, what, 5 months?
A short period of time. A short period of time. But I think what Sean's trying to convey is that even to, dare I say it, the renal specialist who was looking after her, the growth didn't cause them concern, but didn't well, they just thought it was an abscess, but it was a skin cancer.
Well, it was obviously a dreadful experience, and I suppose what the committee are looking at is what lessons we can learn for patients in the future to try and look at preventative work.
And that's what we've tried to do, is to keep this as not impersonal, but try and keep as much of it's very obviously a very emotive issue for us, but to try and keep as much of that out of it to make it clear that it's not a personal issue against a particular health authority or a particular doctor. It's about trying to change things for the better.
I'll maybe try and bring some of my colleagues in. Can I start with John Wilson?
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. And once again, reiterate the Convener's comment about sorry for your loss in this situation, but hopefully we can actually move this petition forward and get some answers to the questions that you've raised, because clearly in your submission you've highlighted that the organ transplant patients have a 40 to 70% chance of developing skin cancer, which is quite high, and you've given some comparisons with the normal population. Clearly the issue here is that in terms of the advice that was given in relation to the consultant in terms of the medication post-operation, post-transplant, and after in relation to what drugs were being prescribed, do you think the doctors had enough information or enough knowledge about the drugs they were actually prescribing?
I think so. I don't think so.
Because it's and you've quite clearly said that if information had been made available and saying about the risks of skin cancer, and basically you've indicated, Mr. Argue, that your daughter would continue to have went ahead with the transplant, but clearly in this situation would have been more aware of checking the body for any growths that may arise following the transplant. So in relation to how we take this petition forward, do you think there is a need for more education, not only for the consultants, the patients, but also particularly for GPs?
Yeah, definitely for GPs. This guy been writing prescription for he used my daughter. Wasn't aware of the risk itself, obviously. The big problem for me in here is Sharon could probably been saved if this was picked up earlier. Every one of you have spots that we know them. They pick them, they maybe bleed. And as the end of it heals, no problems. But in Sharon's case, the spot develops its own bloodstream. Once it goes through in the liver, the cancer spreads through our body rapidly.
Oh. Yeah. Convener, that's all the questions I have. Wish the petitioners best of luck.
Thank you. Chick Brodie.
Yeah, just to follow on that, good morning, gentlemen. And I add my condolences to those expressed before. In the petition, page 2, you say the doctor advised that skin cancer was a very common problem, and yet we're hearing that it might be known, and he thought it was common, but it doesn't appear to be that common across the medical profession. Have you had two comments based on the good work that you've done, Mr. Thompson, in terms of Googling and what international information is available that supports this? And have you had contact with those that are involved in the Melanoma Society and things like that? How do you, on a personal level, know what we're going to do, but on a personal level, raise the profile of this particular situation?
On a personal level, I had, this was done via social media. I'd contacted various NHS authorities with regard to this. Had contacted the Health Secretary and the First Minister's office, and had received a brief correspondence that it was a constituency issue. So my MSP is Jamie Hepburn. Jamie had taken this issue up. I believe also that Greg McClymont, who's the Labour MP for my constituency, Greg had written a letter to the Health Secretary about it. Generally, I hadn't received any feedback from any official body via social media. The feedback had been from either patients' organisations. One had been from West London, where they had expressed their, in my naivety, I had assumed that what had happened was, dare I say, the tip of the iceberg, and that this is what happened throughout the country. But it then transpired that, well, it's not what happens throughout the country. We and Sharon were just extremely unfortunate that she happened to be in an authority where they were well behind the game. I'd received from the West London Kidney Patients Association, I'd received a message from a person stating that from personal experience, i.e. from being a transplant patient from 2001, that it had pretty much been drummed into them from day one that you have to constantly check yourself, you have to be very careful. When you're on this medication, there is a very high risk that you'll develop skin cancer. Received a message from a...
Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, no.
That concerns me, because in your particular case, which is very difficult, that comment could be made in isolation. I mean, there should be silence blazing if somebody's having a transplant to say, here's the upside and here's the downside. And what you're telling us is that doesn't happen.
Correct.
Any GP should look at my daughter's notes where it prescribes. Some should flash up, transplant patient, be aware of skin risks.
I can understand that, and to touch on what was discussed with the the previous petition, that for people that, you know, it's a big enough task just to get them through the operation. You know, you're getting a heart, a liver, or kidney transplant. You perhaps don't want to know that, you know, 5, 10, 15 years down the line, you're going to get skin cancer, because, you know, I know if, easy to say, but I know if it was me in that position, I'd think, well, let's deal with that 5, 10 or 15 years down the line. Just, I want to be here in that time, so it's not a for or against, but it's like you rightly say. I mean, it is very disturbing.
I understand that, but given the serious nature of this, we do spend a lot of money on research. We do have companies, pharmaceutical companies, that spend lots of money on research. And clearly, if this is a very common problem, then we should be asking some questions as to what they're doing in terms of research in this area.
Completely agree. Yeah, completely agree.
And McTaggart.
And thanks, convener, and welcome panel, and saddened of your loss. Really, I'm just flabbergasted that kind of information isn't readily available. And you would have probably heard it was me that had asked earlier about the campaign, and they weren't aware of. We weren't aware when before we had looked at your petition that there was a side effect, and you're right, it should be screaming on screens. That's part of it.
You would think, reading what's down there, that this can't be true. I mean, there must be, you know, some. But the fact that it's got support of medical professionals, especially in the field of nephrology, I would, you know, it speaks for itself that they know there is an issue here that needs to be addressed.
I can't tell you how much that saddens and angers me. But the other point would have been, I mean, obviously it's not an anti-against. You've said earlier that Sharon would have continued, but there would have been that information for her to make the informed choice thereafter for the aftercare aspect of it, like what you had said. So it's not to go against people opting in or opting out for transplants. It's just really about information, and I think that's important. I think that's one of our duties as well, to ensure that information's there, the good and the bad information about some of that process, because people do ultimately need to make an informed choice.
I've got a friend who's attended Glasgow Hospital just end October there with her sister who is waiting for heart transplant. They gave her all the information of the transplant, but never mentioned a word about the risk in it until Lynn Flowers, a head teacher by the way, asked about it, and the doctor was quite flabbergasted about it, how she knew about it. Asked if she's the medical profession. And he says, well, it's something you might have to be aware of. Just not enough information.
Thank you. Thanks.
Adam Ingram.
Thanks, convener, and thanks very much for coming along today and presenting your petition. I think it's a great service that you're actually providing for us in the Scottish Parliament, because it's certainly the first time I've heard of this particular issue. And I understand that the transplant operation took place about 8 years ago. Could you tell me just what kind of follow-up support your partner had in that time? Was there any sort of clinics held in terms of checking out for skin problems or the like? What actually was provided?
What was provided was she would go on initially post-op, it was, from recollection, it would be fortnightly, and she would get blood taken. And the blood tests would be to check renal function, to check that the body wasn't rejecting new kidney, to check that it was working correctly, and it was. To all intents and purposes, it was a success. Our clinics were then reduced back to either 4 weekly or 6 weekly, and again it was a blood check just to check the levels in the blood and that the kidney was continuing to function. But there was no aspect of these consultations was to do with skin checks or or that sort of thing.
Shammy get her to go up and get her test done in Milton's, go home, if any problems with phone her, and she'll back up and get me done again. And
well, everything was actually within the Monklands area. There was no reference to consultants elsewhere.
She was originally Glasgow, but then I can't remember the exact date, but NHS Lanarkshire had the renal clinic at Monklands was established maybe 1-2 years post-op, and that was when she transferred there because we live in Lanarkshire. But originally,
was that at Stop Hill Hospital?
Yeah, originally pre and post-op, it was Stop Hill Hospital was the hospital she attended prior to the op, and the actual surgical team was at the Western Infirmary in Glasgow.
I just find it astonishing that there was no proper communications between all the experts in this field, and that NHS Lanarkshire didn't actually have a unit suitably set up for this purpose. My understanding is that they are now setting up a unit. Is this a consequence of your experience and what you've done in terms of following through on this?
I would hazard a guess that perhaps NHS Lanarkshire officially would say no, but in my opinion, it's certainly a contributing factor.
Yeah, sorry to draw it to close. I'm afraid we're a bit short of time.
Sure.
But again, thank you very much for coming along. Just one point, just to clarify. I think you said you wrote to Nicola Sturgeon at one stage, yes, when she was health sec. When was that?
That would have been back in August. Back in August.
Thank you for that. Well, clearly it's a very sensitive issue. I think a very, very important petition that you put forward to us today. Clearly it's important that we continue the petition and ask various organisations about their view. You would have heard that with the previous petition that we had, such as Scottish Government, NHS Scotland and NHS Blood and Transplant. Do my colleagues have any other organisations you'd write to? John Wilson?
Could I suggest we write to the BMA, the individual health boards, about the advice that they give the post-op clinics and pre-op and patient advice? And could we also write to the Melanoma Society to ask them their views on this petition as well?
Okay. Do members have any other options that they wish to pursue? Are members all happy then that we continue the petition in terms that I've outlined earlier? That's agreed unanimously. Well, thanks very much for coming along. As you can hear that we're taking a big interest in your petition. Our officials will keep you in touch with how it's going, and can I thank you both for coming along, which I know must have been a very painful event for you. So thanks so much for giving up your time. I suspend for 2 minutes.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Our third, could I restart our committee? The third new petition today is PE 1452 by Vince Mills on the People's Charter. Members have a note by the clerk, the spice briefing on the petition, and can I also welcome Elaine Smith, MSP, to meeting, who's an interest in the petition. Could I welcome our witnesses today, Vince Mills and John Foster. You're very welcome. Thanks for coming along. If I can start by asking Mr Mills to make a short presentation. If you could make around 5 minutes, Mr Mills, and then I'll ask Elaine Smith to make some supporting comments. I'll ask a couple of questions, then I'll bring my colleagues in. Mr Mills.
Thank you very much, Convener, and thank you to the committee for inviting us to present evidence here today. I'll just briefly set out the aims of the People's Charter and explain what we hope to achieve by petitioning the Parliament. I think the People's Charter should be seen primarily as a response to and a refutation of the politics of austerity. It outlines 6 key areas where we need to build a better life for the vast majority of the Scottish people. expanding the economy, creating more jobs, building decent homes, delivering good public services, and bringing about more equality and peace. The supporters of austerity will give us recession, fewer jobs, poor services for the poor, and decent services only for the rich, greater inequality and continuous conflict. And we would argue that's precisely what's happening throughout Europe and the UK at present. The People's Charter is non-party political. It seeks support from people across all parties and all sections of society. The Charter is in full support of the STUC's There Is a Better Way campaign, and the STUC Congress supports the People's Charter. We can therefore speak with some confidence when we say we have the support of the organised labour movement in Scotland. In relation to cuts in public expenditure, the People's Charter is absolutely clear. It opposes all cuts, whether they come from Holyrood or Westminster, and even if they're delivered more slowly and less deeply than those currently being driven through by the UK Conservative and Liberal Democratic government. We believe that the financial crisis we're experiencing is the fault of profit-driven financiers, not ordinary people, and therefore that the majority of Scottish people should not have to pay the price for the financiers' greed. Instead, increased taxation and growth through increased public ownership and public spending are fair ways out of the crisis. The specific measures which we suggest in the petition are examples of the kind of things which we think the Scottish Parliament could do to reverse the politics of austerity and inequality. It's certainly not an exhaustive list, and in the area of housing, for instance, we believe there is a real need to go beyond the measures we've suggested in our position as a matter of some urgency. We've produced a document which I believe the clerk has passed to you, and in this we've listed the committees which we believe may be able to take our proposals forward, and we hope the Petitions Committee will decide to forward our demands to these committees. Thank you for listening, and we'll do our best to answer any questions you have.
Thanks very much, Mr Mills. I'll bring in Elaine Smith.
Thank you very much, Convener, and thanks to yourself and committee members for allowing me to attend and say a few words in support of PE 01452, the People's Charter. Can I start by declaring an interest as a member of the People's Charter Scottish Organising Committee and as a member of Unite the Union? First of all, I want to commend the People's Charter Organising Committee for bringing this petition forward in this way to the Scottish Parliament, and also to note that it does have the support of many trade unions in Scotland and the STUC. The 6 demands are not radical demands, Convener. What they are, within those demands, there are actually simple and achievable steps to start putting people first before profit-driven financiers at this time of austerity. And I would say that to yourself and committee members, the Charter is a common sense approach, and what it does is it would allow us to move from the arguments about whose cuts are the most vicious and instead concentrate on delivering more public sector building projects, the creation of better jobs and tackling poverty and inequality. And the alternative to that seems to be unemployment cuts and more despair. So as the People's Charter representatives here today have said, there are specific examples of practical measures that the Scottish Government could take and various committees that could perhaps look in more depth at those practical measures. So once again, can I welcome the petition's arrival at the Parliament and thank the committee for their consideration of it.
Thank you very much, Elaine Smith. Just on a technical point, I won't prejudge the committee's decision later on, but technically we can only refer to one other committee. We can't refer to 5 different committees, but not to worry, we will discuss that at a later stage. Obviously, could I congratulate your work that you've done on the People's Charter, and I think the 1,000 signatures you've had to date, and just for the record, I think I was at one of your earlier events, and as a member of Unison, I think Unison have signed up to the People's Charter. And obviously, Mr Foster, feel free to add your contribution at any stage. My first question is just to ask a little bit more about one of the points I found quite interesting was the issue of social impact assessments for procurement. Could you perhaps say a little bit more about how you see that working in practice?
Which number is that, Convener?
That was the issue of around procurement and how you would have to make an assessment at each stage of the social impact of procurement decisions in the public sector particularly.
This was probably the living wage, wasn't it?
0.5. Thank you.
This is In reference to local authority,
yes,
yeah, it tends to go under the term of needs budgets nowadays, which is why I was a bit slow in responding to you. Essentially, what we're concerned about there is that there's been a downward pressure on local authority budgets for some time for a number of reasons, including the council tax freeze as well as the UK budget cuts. And we think it's important that local authorities make it clear to the wider public the implications of that in terms of what they need to spend as opposed to what they have to spend, so that people can get a proper assessment of the impact of reductions in local authority budgets and in local services.
And if my final question before I bring my colleagues in, you made some interesting comments as well around employee participation, which obviously has a long pedigree. And
yes,
we had some of trade union colleagues and some academics in an earlier stage who were talking about being involved in the public sector, that, you know, in one sense everyone talks a good game about employee participation, but there's a great danger in the public sector of having a very top-down management model. Could you perhaps say a little bit more about employee participation and how that would work?
Happy to convey it. Yeah, I think we'd actually want to argue it should go beyond just the public sector. Yeah. I mean, you're quite right. You could go back to 1973 in the Bullock Report, which argued, I think, what we would now see as a fairly radical model of a 50-50 overarching board which ran enterprises. And it's that kind of radical solution we'd hope the Scottish Parliament might want to explore. But of course that's not the only form of economic democracy. I think things like trade union ownership of pension funds and even worker ownership of shares in companies would be within the compass of the proposals we would want to consider.
Okay. Mr. Foster, do you have anything to add?
No, I would simply reiterate, I think, what Mr. Mills has already said on that subject. I would like to be able to make a contribution about housing at some point.
Certainly. Chick Brody.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Mills, Mr. Foster. Having read your proposal and your petition, I have some difficulty because what gets me up in the morning is the list of things that you have indicated and what we are trying to do in terms of fairer jobs. And on a personal level, I agree with more employee participation. In fact, effectively introduced that to some of the companies I handled in terms of troubleshooting before I came to this particular place. I'm sure, of course, it's well meant and well intended, but I'm struggling on a personal level as to how, you know, in a democracy, and, you know, if we have effective opposition, that these questions are and should be asked. And in fact, I also sit in the Economy Committee where Stephen Boyd comes along and makes the point. So I'm struggling with where this is different from what we do in terms of electing governments, electing oppositions, raising these issues under the democratic umbrella. Where is it different?
I think what you're making there is perhaps an easy assumption that can be challenged, and that is that political parties necessarily represent what the vast majority of people believe in. For example, it's clear that since the trade union...
But that's what elections are about, and people stand there and go through the process.
It may be what elections are about, but you're making the assumption that political parties are representing what the electorate demands.
I'm not making any assumption, Mr. Mills.
Well, if you aren't making an assumption, this question you asked doesn't make sense.
Okay, you go ahead and say what the assumption is.
The assumption is that there's a direct relationship between what political parties are arguing and what the electorate want, and there's clear evidence in relation to this charter, for example, which the SGC supports, that parties are not arguing for these things.
I beg to differ. As I said, I got up in the morning because of these things and trying to make these things better for our fellow citizens. If you like, I'm trying to follow people's charter, believing what people need and what people want. So where are you different from the democratic process?
It's a question of broadening democracy, not narrowing it. I wouldn't accept that you're actually advocating these things. For example, are you advocating bus regulation?
If there's an issue with that, and with policy that we set, then there should be an opposition, if they agree with it, and they can raise the questions through the democratic process.
And what I'm saying to you is there's clearly a democratic breakdown here, because despite the demand for that kind of thing, there's no evidence of it being properly dealt with in the Scottish Parliament.
There are some economic issues that I won't go through the arguments that we've had about, funding, etc. But, clearly there are sets of priorities. But the democratic process, what you're trying to do is have a cling on to the democratic process. If oppositions are working effectively, if governments are working effectively, and I repeat, this is why I get up in the morning and come here, I don't see where the value add is.
If there were absolutely no other social pressures and political parties which shape the kind of policies they advocate, and there was a direct line between political parties and the electorate, then I think your argument would be sound. But given the number of pressures, for example, you're currently, I noticed through Neil Findlay, going to explore the issue of lobbying, that since political parties are obviously shaped by other interests than the democratic one, it's not valid to argue that the Scottish Parliament deals absolutely democratically with all the issues of concern of the Scottish people.
I disagree with that.
Can I come in on this? Because I think one of the great strengths of a Scottish Parliament, certainly in its original vision, was the degree to which it did respond to Civic Scotland. And it did see a horizon that included the political parties, but also saw Civic Scotland, which includes the trade union movement, as a very important part of the democratic process. And on this specific issue of employee participation, I think you would agree that it hasn't in any way been taken forward with the effectiveness that it should be. And I'm sure,
in your opinion?
In my opinion, but I would have thought possibly also yours, because you're arguing that you have to push this. I think we all know of structures of employment that are certainly not fulfilling those perspectives, and they do to great detriment the employees and also probably the overall functioning of the institutions. For that reason, I would have hoped that you would have welcomed on this particular issue, but maybe others as well, the degree to which the organisations of Civic Scotland have supplemented the pressures to take this forward.
Yeah, I mean, Civic Scotland, trade unions, all play an important part, which is why I think we try to have an open parliament, why we have sessions like this, why we have witnesses at other committees. Is it perfect? No. But I still question where the value add is from having the Charter in relation to the engagement with Civic Scotland that we have, with the political process that we have. I just, I'm not demeaning how well-meaning it is. I'm just saying I don't see where this adds value. Well, of course it adds value because input from everybody is important. But I'm saying in terms of enacting these, I repeat, I'll stop now, that's what gets me up in the morning. Jobs for people, fairer economy, reducing the income gap, all of these things. Participation, even within the economic constraints that we have. Thank you, Convener.
John Wilson.
Thank you, Convener. Welcome to the Petitions Committee this morning. And could I open by declaring an interest in this issue as a signatory to the Charter, and also knowing the petitioner for a few decades, I think, maybe slightly longer. But the questions and I think there are issues that have been raised, and I think Chick Brodie made the point in relation to John Foster's comment about this Parliament being more open to the people, and the Public Petitions Committee was a commitment to that openness, to allow individuals and organisations to bring along petitions. And I'm generally supportive of all the objectives within, irrespective of political party, but I think there are issues around the political party element, because I don't think any political party has fully signed up to the Charter. I think individuals within political parties have, but I'm not aware of any political party that has. Just a couple of questions in terms of the objectives of the Charter. In relation to the written submission, the original written submission, there's reference made to, in Section 2, more and better jobs. And you make the quite laudable comment about reduce hours, not pay, which is we shouldn't reduce hours and reduce incomes. But you also talk about a minimum wage of half the national median earnings. Can you remind me what the national median earnings are at the present moment?
No, I couldn't. And actually, can I say that what we focused on today was the specific suggestions we made in the petition, rather than the overarching petition which you're referring to, John, which wasn't really the subject to this particular discussion.
And it was just trying to explore that in light of the Scottish Living Wage campaign and what the Scottish Government have accepted, and I think parties across, the majority of parties in the Parliament have accepted the Scottish Living Wage objective of £7.45 an hour, and I was just trying to put that in the context of the median earnings, UK median earnings. My calculations, rough calculations this morning, the minimum wage, unfortunately, is about half the national median earnings, but clearly it's not enough of an income to actually satisfy the basic needs of the majority of those people on the minimum wage. The other issue, and I know John Foster's particular interest in housing, and this might give John an opportunity to come in the issue of housing, particularly social housing, local authority housing. The Scottish Government in the last 5 years has attempted to reinvigorate the social rented housing market and openly encouraging local authorities to build council housing, which we had actually been diminishing for about a decade. We're now seeing local authorities actually increasing their stock by, unfortunately, increasing their stock at a time when stock has been sold off under the right to buy. Do you think we can actually generate enough of an interest in local authorities to use their powers, borrowing powers, to actually increase council housing stock throughout the country? Bearing in mind, sorry, that Glasgow doesn't have any housing stock because they transferred theirs to GHA a number of years ago.
And a number of other local authorities have unfortunately done so as well. But that is certainly an avenue that can be adopted, and the People's Charter would very much support local authorities that went down that road. But I think one of the key issues that we wanted to raise on the subject of housing is the immediate impact and long-term impact also of the housing benefit changes on the viability of the entire social housing sector, both local community-based housing associations and also council housing. Certainly in Govan, which is the area I'm involved in, the Community Council and Secretary of the Tenants Association, there are 3 local community-based housing associations that see their own future viability seriously threatened by the changes in housing benefit regulation, particularly the so-called bedroom tax, whereby there will be massive cuts in housing benefit, up to 25% for having 2 unoccupied bedrooms and 14% for 1. They estimate, say, in the 3 housing associations in our area, that there will be something around 500 people in this category who will find their housing benefit cut to this degree within the next 12 months. So it's an urgent problem for them. We've also been faced with the cap in housing benefit that will, of 1%, that will be imposed from the coming April. And that, in terms of the overall population on housing benefit, will generate deficiencies in the ability to pay rent and resulting in evictions of something like 5 or 6% within a couple of years because of the increase in rents. So these are big problems for the whole social housing sector, but there are obviously also very serious problems for tenants. And I can speak from a meeting that was attended by almost 100 people just a couple of weeks ago in Govan. People are being told if they cannot pay the rent, they will be evicted. There are not enough 1 or 2 bedroom houses within the social sector. And it's going to affect very large numbers of people. So this is an immediate thing, and one of the key aspects of the People's Charter for Scotland is to say the Scottish Parliament has certain powers. It has a certain amount of financial resource, but not very much. But in some areas, it can use those powers that will be to the benefit of people, or at least, in the current circumstances, to prevent great hardship. And the two things that we're proposing is that in place of eviction, there be an amendment to Scottish housing law that would enable the normal course of debt collection to kick in rather than the automatic eviction that would take place for significant rent arrears in the case of the bedroom tax. We're also suggesting that there be a consideration of rent regulation for the private sector, because one of the certain consequences of these new regulations in Glasgow, and I don't think they've probably been properly thought through at all, and I'm sure it'll apply in other cities and areas, will be that people will be forced into the private housing sector. People, when they're evicted or become homeless, there are not enough accommodation within the social sector, so they will be forced into the private sector. The private sector, I think, as a result of inquiries by this body, has been shown to be extremely uneven in the way in which it practices any care for tenants, and there are areas that are totally unscrupulous where we can expect rents to be pushed up. For that reason, it is certainly the argument here that there are powers of the Scottish Parliament over housing legislation that would permit the regulation of rents, a cap on the increase of rents, maybe in line with the increase in housing benefit of 1%, that would offset the ability of unscrupulous landlords to exploit this situation. So those are the two specific things that we're putting forward here.
I thank Mr Foster for his explanation of the policy that put forward. Quite clearly you opened up by saying the changes that are proposed in the welfare benefit reforms that are being pushed by Westminster. Many of the changes that the Scottish Government can actually introduce will only protect, in some degree, the tenants and people dependent on whether it be public sector housing or private sector housing. The main issue here is the changes, draconian changes that are coming out from Westminster in relation to the whole raft of welfare benefit reform. But housing is one of those areas where quite clearly we see that the rents that are going to be paid, or the levels of rent paid to individuals, could be capped and further capped under the present Westminster system. How do you see a Scottish Government, apart from some of the changes that you've suggested, protect the worst excesses of a Westminster Government that's following policies at the present moment of massive public sector cuts, as well as benefit cuts that will impact upon many citizens? And the figures that are being currently quoted is something like £2.5 billion less income for the Scottish economy through the welfare reform proposals that are currently coming out of Westminster. How do we protect them, or how does the Scottish Government, the present Scottish Government or a future Scottish Government, protect those individuals against a Westminster Government that has the fiscal powers to impose these types of benefit changes?
I would suggest there are some limited measures that can be taken, and they certainly were discussed at the meeting we had in Govan, which had at it a Minister of the Scottish Government and also the leader of the Labour Party in the Scottish Parliament. And those were the creation of funds in two regards. One is a fund that can be made available for acute emergency cases where we're dealing with tenants who are unable to pay their rent. And secondly, that there should be some fund made available also to assist housing associations that are going to, within a year or two, find their financial circumstances extremely difficult. So those are two practical proposals. Obviously, they're limited by the funds that the Scottish Parliament has available, but nonetheless, they could be taken.
Thank you very much.
In terms of the overall question, obviously it is a matter of finance, and that is, again, a matter, I think, that's of wider debate currently.
Right.
Thank you. Before I bring Angus MacDonald in, the committee will be aware that we do have a Welfare Reform Committee, and one other option for the committee is to make a referral to that committee at some stage in the future. Angus MacDonald.
Indeed. Thanks, Convener. Mr Mills and Mr Foster have raised a number of salient points so far this morning, and clearly, Convener, I think we could debate all the issues raised the rest of the day and possibly all night. Just one point I'd like to pick up on with Mr Mills, and a note that public transport is mentioned in the late submission in paragraph 4 of the late submission. On bus regulation, which you threw in there a wee while ago, figures that I have been provided with would suggest that it would cost up to £1 billion to renationalise or deregulate the bus services. So, you know, clearly we have an issue there with regard to funding. I mean, it's all very well to have a wish list, and I have a lot of sympathy for it, but if the money just simply isn't there, then it creates a difficulty. With regard to paragraph 3 in the late submission, Mr Foster, there's particular mention about housing and the concern regarding the lack of social housing. Now, when I was a governor of the Falkirk Pension Fund, we initiated some investigations into the possibility of the pension fund using the innovative measure of building social and affordable housing through the pension fund, and it actually ticked a lot of boxes by giving the pension fund a guaranteed rate of return, which also provided badly needed social housing, particularly when we have in Falkirk District up to 8,000 people on the waiting list. So I'd be interested to hear what your views would be on using pension funds for, particularly local authority pension funds, for that purpose, and would you be keen to support that?
On the regulation issue, obviously I don't have the figures you're referring to, but considering that buses get a substantial public subsidy at the moment, and that this would, over a longer period of time, one assumes, if you were talking about taking the bus companies into social ownership, which is not what we're advocating, it's regulation, then I assume there would be considerable savings to be made in that direction.
I would personally say that initiatives of that kind would be welcome. They are limited, they're relatively small scale, but they could have productive results in terms of providing more social housing. But in terms of the objectives of the People's Charter at British level, it certainly would argue for the creation of a new type of financial and banking system that would be under the control of the public sector, and therefore would be able to channel funds towards infrastructural projects on a much larger scale. And that, I would have thought, would be one of the avenues to go forward in terms of solving the problem in terms of Scottish housing, which is a very expensive one, but an absolutely necessary one in the long run.
I believe, Convener, pension funds were used possibly 50 years ago, so yeah, we're actually going full circle. And, yeah. It's
so was regulation.
Taggart?
Yeah, thanks, Convener, and welcome to the panel. And also, I declare an interest that I'm signed up to the People's Charters and the aims also. Really, what one I had meant to pick out was number 6, and it was really the credit unions. And given that both the convener and the vice convener are sitting round the table at this moment in time, it's maybe something that we could take back to the cross-party working group and credit unions to see whereby we could extend that. But given the array of and the complexity of the issues that are raised, I think, Convener, when you mentioned earlier about the Welfare Reform Committee as opposed to the other committees that have been mentioned, I think that would be a better idea to give it a better scope and a better listened to approach.
Mr Mills?
Oh, we'd obviously welcome that reference, and I'm pleased that Anne picked up on that issue, because as has become painfully obvious, I think people, especially people in low income paid employment are finding the need to borrow money at unfavourable rates, and sometimes from unsavoury lenders, and increasingly the case, just to survive. So I appreciate that.
Absolutely.
We're a little bit short of time. Do any other members who haven't been in wish to contribute? Chuck Brewer, you had a brief point.
Just a very brief. Again, yeah, don't get me wrong, I support the things that you're trying to do here by and large. Well, I just wonder what engagement you've had with local authorities. It might surprise you to know that one local authority known to me underspent its budget by £7 million last year, and after provisions and reserves, it had £4 million. What engagement have you had with local authorities to understand what their financial position is and how some of these programmes might be well implemented?
Our engagement has principally been with the trade unions representing local government workers, and consequently the perspective which we're putting forward and which we share is the one which the local government workers have. I would say in the example you gave, I don't know which authority you're referring to, I can assure you the trade unions would be the ones who would be most upset about an underspend of that magnitude, given that so many local authorities are currently cutting staff and services.
They're not the only ones.
Thank you. Does any other colleague have questions? So there's a number of options. I mean, normally at this stage we would ask for more information before making next step. I think members will recall my initial statement that we can't refer to more than one committee. There's a number of committees that our petitioners have rightly identified. I think I also identified the Welfare Reform Committee. That would pick up Mr Foster's point on housing. Amataga, could I just clarify, were you talking about a separate committee in your comments?
No, sorry.
Welfare Reform,
no.
Right.
Welfare Reform.
So there's a number of options. One option would be to continue it and ask the Scottish Government for the views on the petition, and at that stage, when it comes back, to then make a decision about next steps. Or we could refer on to another committee at this stage, but I'm in the hands of the committee. I'm quite relaxed about next steps. John Wilson?
Can I support that we keep the petition with the Public Petitions Committee at the present moment, right to the Scottish Government, but there's a number of other organisations I would like to seek the opinion of in relation to the issues that have been raised by the petition, particularly SCVO, given the issues about the voluntary sector and the pay and conditions that are being cut in the voluntary sector, because we know that they have been, some of them, the voluntary sector has been hardest hit in terms of the current recession. I could also suggest we write to the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations to ask them their views on the housing issues. Chartered Institute of Housing Scotland, once again to ask about housing, particularly in the private sector, because the Chartered Institute of Housing, believe it or not, sometimes represents private landlord interests as well as other interests. CBI Scotland, Community Ownership Scotland, and last but not least, COSLA.
Thank you for that. Does any member have any additional organisations that we should be writing to? Are members happy with the suggestions that I put forward and that John Wilson has suggested? Yeah. So it's agreed unanimously then that we'll continue the petition to write to all these agencies. When the information comes back, we'll then look at the next steps. So it will be an active live petition until our next meeting, which will be when our next appropriate meeting when we got the information back. Could I thank Elaine Smith for coming along and supporting the petition, and for Vince Mills and John Foster for giving the evidence. I think it's a very thoughtful petition, so thanks for coming along and giving us your views, and obviously we'll keep this as a live active petition until we get all the information back that we require. I suspend for 2 minutes to allow witnesses to leave. Thank you both.
Thank you.
And that we're on the fourth new petition today is PE 1444 by Florence Kennedy on the Mutual Repairs Incentive Scheme. Members have a note by the clerk, the spice briefing and the petition. I'd invite members to have a look at this interesting petition. Certainly to my mind it makes a lot of sense to continue this in line with 8.1, which will be writing to the Scottish Government, Royal and Corporation of Architects and so on. I'm open to obviously committee members' alternative views on that. Members agreeable that we take this forward? So it's agreed then that we'll continue this petition in line of action 8.1. Thank you for that. John Wilson.
I'm on the same petition. There's 144.
Yes.
Convener, the petitioner has asked that we actually make representation to the UK government as well.
Sure.
Which isn't in the clerk's advice. Could I suggest we write to the UK government to ask what assistance can be given to residents of tenement properties in light of the decision to increase VAT, to add VAT to repairs? Yes, and it's there is a particular issue around VAT. I think that's a good point. Are members agreeable then that we will deal with that? Thank you. If I move on then to PE 1447 by Jerry McClellan on protection for landlords. Member of the note by the clerk, the spice briefing and the petition, and can invite members to consider the petition and to make some recommendations about next steps. John Wilson. Thank you, Convener. I think we should take this petition forward, but I also think it would be relevant to contact other bodies in relation to this, particularly the Chartered Institute House in Scotland, SFHA, and also the Scottish Landlord Association, to ask them their views as well as the Scottish Government. Thank you for that. Are members agreeable with John Wilson's suggestion? Have any other suggestions they wish to add? No, that's agreeable. Then we're going to go ahead in terms of 9.1, raise recommendations, and the extra points added by John Wilson. If I can move to the sixth and final new petition is PE 1461 by William Campbell on protection for third parties in the planning process. Can I just note for the record that I know Mr Campbell and I've made representations on his behalf in the past. Mary Scanlon's also got an interest in the petition. And could I ask Mary Scanlon if she'd like to address the committee?
Well, thank you, Convener. It's very grateful for allowing me in here. Like yourself, Convener, I've known Mr Campbell for many, many years, and I'm actually looking at the note by the clerk, and in paragraph 3 it says Scottish planning system works on the assumption that all parties operate freely and without any malign influence, which is a very reasonable point. But I would really like to draw the committee members' attention to paragraph 5, which states, issues such as bullying and harassment of third parties cannot at present be considered by a planning authority as part of the decision-making process, as they do not relate to the development or use of land. Now, that is an absolutely reasonable comment as well, and I don't think we could disagree with that. But my concern, Convener, is that allegations, and that's all we could say at this time, of bullying and harassment, you know, if they do exist, it can enormously affect the number of objections. And objections are a significant part of the decision-making by a planning authority. So my concern is that bullying and harassment, although it cannot be taken into account by councillors making the decision, the absence of objections could have a significant effect. The other point I wanted to raise was, if people are withdrawing from the planning process because of allegation, because of bullying, harassment, etc., then basically we no longer have a democratic system. And I think many people think that, you know, this NIMBY, not in my backyard, and that everyone who has an objection, that it's very critical and destructive. But I know myself, Convener, and I'm sure you do as well, that many people object because they want something not to be quite so big, but more in keeping with the area. And many objections, if you like, are actually very constructive and very positive. And my worry is that if people have a fear of participating in the process, it can actually be detrimental to the whole planning process. And just, if I may, Convener, just my final point would be on paragraph 7, which describes the conduct, harassment can be prosecuted under Scots law as a breach of the peace. You know, I think it's one thing if you live in a big major city and if you don't talk to your neighbour, it doesn't really matter. But if you live in a Highland Glen or a village and your neighbour is very much part of your life, you know, people don't want long-lasting feuds. And the other problem is that I know I've spoken to the police about this. It's one person's word against another. So I'm not saying I'm no expert on the law. I'm not saying there isn't a law that covers it. But it's very difficult to say, oh, someone came to my door last night and persuaded me to take my name out of objecting to that. And many people don't want to put their head above the parapet in order that their neighbour would be prosecuted. And I just wanted to point that out. In a small rural area, these things are much more difficult than they are in a major city. So these were all the points that I wish to raise, having spoken to the petitioner over many years. And like you, I know him and his family.
And just to clarify, Mary Scanlon, is your views then that we should continue the petition and write to the Scottish Government, seeking the views of...
Well, I realise I'm an outsider sitting in here, but I would be very comfortable with that approach, just to look to addressing some of the issues that I've raised. But I do appreciate the difficulties.
Thank you for that. Kit Brodie?
Yeah, I have a concern about this. I understand the basis, but it's a two-way process. And I know circumstances, in fact, I've been involved in one, where an objector has objected to planning permission in the most vociferous terms, and the council has then put that up on a website. So we need to be very careful, and I think when we take this forward, that harassment can work two ways.
Yeah, thank you. John Wilson?
I accept Chick Brodie's point that harassment can work two ways, but the issue and the recent experience of an applicant, planning applicant, harassing a neighbour in a rural area and to the detriment of the well-being and normal life of the individuals involved who decided to object to a planning application that was being put forward. So that I think there are serious issues here about how people, both applicants and objectors, are protected under the current planning legislation. And while the petitioner's right and Mary Scanlon's right to say that the planning authority should not take account of any issues apart from what they have in front of them in terms of the application and the objections in writing. But the difficulty is for many individuals, they do face intimidation, harassment, and in some extreme cases, violence from applicants or objectors. And it's really trying to get to that situation that I think we should take this petition forward. But as well as writing to the Scottish Government, Convener, could I suggest we write to ACPOS, COSLA and Planning Aid Scotland to get their views on this petition? Because I think there are some omissions within the current planning legislation that might need to be looked at to ensure that everybody has the opportunity to freely express their views, whether they be an applicant or an objector, without fear of intimidation, harassment or violence.
No, I think that's a reasonable approach. Are members agreeable with that step? Right. So it's agreed that we can continue this petition, and we're going to write to these agencies that John Wilson has outlined, and also that was outlined in 10.1 in the clerk's recommendations. I can thank Mary Scanlon for coming along and providing us with some help to look at the next steps in this petition.
And I thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak.
Thank you for that. If I move on to our consideration of current petitions, it's PE 1408 by Andrea MacArthur on the updating of pernicious anemia, deficiency, understanding and treatment. And members will recall we actually had a debate in the Chamber about this, which I think was quite successful. There's certainly some suggestions from Andrea MacArthur that we seek a response from the Scottish Government on the active B12 test before we look at the next steps. I think that makes quite a lot of sense. What our committee's view? people happy to be continuous to seek the Scottish Government view? Okay, so it's agreed then we're continuous petition because there's still some outstanding points from the Scottish Government we need to consider. If we move on to the next current petition, it's PE 1424 by Joyce Harkness on behalf of the Road to Health CPP 3 team on improving transport provision for older people in remote and rural areas. Members have a note by the clerk and can invite contributions from members.
Construction and Capital Investment Committee have agreed to an inquiry into this area of work, so it seems sensible to refer this to the committee.
I think that's sensible. Members agreeable? So it's agreed to refer the petition under Rule 15.6.2 to the Infrastructure and Capital Investment Committee on the basis that they're looking and inquiring into community and demand-led transport. And the third current petition is PE 1433 by John Hancock on productive land for landless Scots to grow their own food. Members have a note by the clerk. John Wilson's taken a particular interest in this. Mr Wilson?
Thank you, Convener. Yes, I have taken a particular interest in this, and given that I've met with the petitioner on a number of occasions, I think in the first instance, Convener, we should continue with this petition. I think there are still issues in relation to the forthcoming community empowerment and renewable that could raise further questions about how we take this issue forward. But the other issue that the petitioner has raised in his response is the issue about why certain trees are not included in the current planting programme. In response from various organisations who are currently involved in woodland planting, they have indicated that fruit trees are not currently included in the list of trees that can be planted up. It would be useful if you could write to the Scottish Government to seek clarification as to the guidance issued to the various woodland bodies to find out why fruit trees are not, particularly indigenous fruit trees, are not included in the planting programmes when we reforestation of Scotland.
Is that agreeable?
Well, can I just...
sorry, Chip Brodie.
The petitioner, do we have details of the background? Because it's the same name as a senior planning officer in the Borders.
No, it's not.
It's not the same one?
No, it's not the same person.
Okay.
Is that agreeable?
Fine, yep.
Right. Okay. The fourth current petition is PE 1435 by Wajat Nasar on Scottish Pakistan Youth Council. Members are note by the clerk. I think this is a good point, in fact, that we can close this petition on the basis the council has not yet been established and the Scottish Government cannot endorse or become a stakeholder in its establishment. Is that agreeable?
Yep.
And the final and fifth current petition is PE 1440 by Sharon Klasky on behalf of Play Scotland on plans for the New Children and Young People Bill. Members have a note by the clerk. Can invite contributions from members. John Wilson.
Thank you, Convener. Could I suggest we refer this petition under Rule 15.6.2 to the Education and Culture Committee?
Is that agreeable?
Agreed.
Thank you. That's agreed then. Refer the petition to the Education and Culture Committee on the basis that they have responsibility for scrutinising policy in that area. That's the final petition. Can I, before I finally close the meeting, can I obviously wish members and staff a happy Christmas and good New Year? And could I also ask that our colleagues from Bernardo stay behind, because we're having an informal briefing from them, and can ask that everyone else leave the chamber, and I've formally closed the meeting. Thank you.